Welcome to the Aus Asia Business program with your host, Stacey Martin. Stacey brings together experts, ideas and information on how to navigate business opportunities in Asia.
Dajahal, welcome to the Aus Asia Business program. I'm Stacey Martin, and in the studio today I have David Thorn. David is the CEO of Darway Pty Ltd, which facilitates Chinese investment into the Australian agricultural sector. Welcome to the show, David.
Thanks, Stacey. Great to be here.
David, you're a very experienced banker in Australia, and you've spent some time in Hong Kong heading up a major bank division there. Tell us a little bit about your career journey. I mean, you must have seen so many changes over the last 3 decades.
Yeah, a huge amount of change, both domestically and internationally. The emergence of Asia as a region has probably been the most profound change that I've seen in my 30-odd years of banking.
Wow.
Walked away from banking, though, 2 years ago.
Yep.
A little over 2 years ago now. Hard to believe how quickly that's gone. The reason for that was largely because of what I was seeing in the latter stages of my career in Hong Kong. The inbound interest from Asian investors, the outbound interest from Australian SME agribusinesses and food and beverage producing companies was huge. They wanted to sell more product into Asia, and I'd quite often be asked by Australian agribusiness owners, how can we navigate in Asia? And that was a great opportunity for the bank that I was working for at the time, with a change of CEO and a change of strategy that gave rise to my decision to leave banking and continue to do what I was doing with my team in Asia, and that was capturing that inbound investment.
So it's really getting on that wave, isn't it?
In Australia,
yeah. Look, it's a big wave because obviously with the rising middle class in China, they need more premium products, and so I think we've talked about China seeing Australia as a premium food or a deli. You've worked with people not just in the beef, cattle and dairy, but other sectors as well?
Yeah, that's right. The emergence of Australian horticulture, for example, is opportunity both for the incumbents that are in that sector to get larger, to sell more product, to diversify away from their more traditional customers here in Australia, to sell into that emerging middle class in Asia. Seafood's another good example. The interest in plant protein, organic products, healthy snacks, etc. There's huge interest from Asian consumers.
And our clean and green is a real attraction, isn't it?
That's right, yep. Clean, safe and plentiful, as I like to call it.
Clean, safe and plentiful. Well, speaking of plentiful, the industry is a little bit diverse when it comes to the agricultural sector. How can people really try and leverage? Obviously, we need those farmers need more capital to expand. What's your suggestion about increasing that capacity?
Yeah, regrettably, there's not a lot of... there's more sources available, I find, internationally because of the appeal of Australian food products amongst Asian consumers. There is more interest, I have found anyway, from international investors and off-takers, as I refer to those consumers, those corporate consumers that want to distribute the product through into their Asian markets.
That's a really good idea that, not only is investment coming in to help the farmer expand, but they also provide that direct distribution channel, because that's obviously one of the challenges. If you're an Aussie farmer and in the outback, how are you going to connect with people that are looking for your product? Yeah,
now in the short space of time that I've been operating, the last 2 years, I've managed to secure a dozen mandates with just that, small to mid-sized agribusinesses that are looking for capital. Clearly they can't find it here. Yeah, the banks will provide some capital, but they're probably more risk averse than they've ever been.
Yeah, and you would know that from your banking background. It's not only the bank's capital restraints. There's a lot more focus on affordability and those kind of outcomes. Yeah,
the clients that I deal with and I talk to, helping them get investment ready. They need capital. They don't have access to public debt or equity markets, and as a consequence, they're looking for the right sort of partner. And by the right sort of partner, I'm talking about ones that are going to provide patient capital and access to other consumers. So, if you will, diversifying the revenue streams for Australian agribusinesses into those Asian markets.
And I think, some of that capital is patient because they're seeing the long-term benefit. Obviously, there's a risk angle. They don't necessarily want to, have the volatility, and get some sort of certainty around, they're building an asset, plus it has these additional benefits.
Yeah, that's true. And I guess that may be the reason why Australian investors do have an aversion to agriculture, because it...
Quarterly numbers and...
Well, it's more about exposure to weather. We see quite dramatic impacts that weather has on Australian agriculture, but there are ways and means of mitigating those risks. Sure, you're not going to remove the volatility associated with weather completely, but there are ways in which you can mitigate some of those weather risks quite significantly.
And that's been the real rise in agritech, hasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Protected cropping is another way in which people are able to avoid those weather risks, those disease risks. You're in a controlled environment. So, even geographic diversity. Some of my clients are looking at expanding their footprint in terms of the land that they want to acquire. One of my clients in the cereal cropping sector is looking at a 200-kilometre east-west portfolio because, if it doesn't rain in the western part of the portfolio, the chances are it's going to rain in the eastern part of the portfolio.
Okay.
So
that's
having
really
that
smart, isn't it?
Diversity is a way in which you can mitigate that weather risk.
That's really interesting. And I think the other thing that's happening globally, a hiccup in the US would cause movements in the Australian stock market, but you're seeing a little bit more diversity in movements in markets with local and global factors. Often people sort of refer to what's happening in the US with the sort of political scene. How might that impact on Australia?
The emergence of this so-called trade war between China and the US is quite interesting, and the tariff differentials that will ensue from such a trade war, I think, reflect really well for Australian agriculture, simply because it makes particularly with the free trade agreements that Australia has in place now with a lot of Asian countries.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been increasing. I was at an Austrade briefing recently, and look, a lot of people really aren't sure what those various tariff reductions and briefings kind of mean, but that's really opened up for Australia, hasn't it?
And all of that information is available on the Austrade website, and you are going to see a significant reduction, in a lot of cases down to zero.
Wow.
With those free trade agreements for Australian exported produce. With the tariff the trade wars that are emerging between certain countries globally, who are, by their definition, have been long-term competitors for Australian agriculture. The opportunity for Australia to capitalise on that while others are getting slugged with increased tariffs is right now.
But it's also very much about relationship between Australia and China. And interesting on the political scene, when you think communism, you think, but having been over there as you have, it's quite a capitalist society.
Capitalism is alive and well in China.
And then they sort of look at our domestic situation and see, some infighting or disagreement, and it can take a long time to get things done in Australia, where in China they decide on a policy, they've got their 5-year plan, what they're going to do, and they kind of go ahead and do it. So it's probably a bit more certainty.
Well, there are some rules and regulations that need to be adhered to when you're entering the China market, and once again, there's a lot of information available through Austrade for that sort of export activity. Equally, there's a lot of rules and regulations that need to be adhered to here in Australia. The FIRB process, for example, is something that I encourage a lot of inbound investors to think about as they embark on their investment journey into Australian agribusiness.
The Foreign Investment Review Board, there's been some sort of high-profile cases, but a lot of the deals are approved.
Correct. It just takes time.
Yeah, just takes time.
Like any regulatory body, they need the time to consider those applications. And, I would encourage your international investors who are listening to this podcast to think about getting on board with that regulatory approval process, just as they would their commercial due diligence process. Do that sooner rather than later. So once you've made your decision to invest, get on with getting those regulatory approvals in place.
So you've been listening to David Thorn, consultant in Australian agriculture. After the break, we'll hear more from David about his experience in the sector.
Aus Asia is taking a short break. If you'd like to sponsor this show or be part of Eagle Waves Radio, go to our website, eaglewavesradio.com.au, and contact us. Hey Tess, don't you employ overseas staff and you've been thinking about expanding your business offshore?
Yeah, I have been.
And you have investors that are also considering moving to Australia.
I do.
So a registered migration agent could probably help you with the right visa solution.
But how do you find the right one?
Industry body Migration Alliance has over 4,800 registered agents.
What's the best way to contact them?
Email help@migrationalliance.com.au and you'll find a MARA registered agent right near you.
Cool.
And now, back to you, Stacey.
I'm here in the studio with David Thorn from Darway Pty Ltd. So, David, Darway, I understand that's part of your Chinese name, Song Darway. So you've been sort of targeting this Chinese market for a long time. Tell me how that came about, that you got a Chinese name very early in the piece.
A former colleague of mine that worked in the banking sector had been that bank's chief rep for 30 years, a very esteemed gentleman who suggested that Thorn was very difficult to pronounce in Mandarin. Song, which is wedged between the Ming and the Qing dynasties. The Song dynasty was a very strong dynasty. Song was an appropriate, similar sounding name to Thorn, and Darway literally translate, or David is literally translated as Darway in Chinese. So
fantastic. And look, that's one of the really important things to show Chinese clients, that you are very serious. You've got a Chinese name, you've got your translation on all your collateral and so on, and you're really looking to help them do business.
Yeah, and I'd encourage anyone else who's looking to deal with Chinese to think about a Chinese name before approaching that market.
Fantastic. So we're seeing a lot of different things happening in the agricultural sector, having moved from mining and recognising that need globally for clean, safe and plentiful food. Tell us a little about some of the local trends that you're seeing.
As has been widely reported, quite a bit of activity in the dairy sector, good and bad. There's been some significant transactions occur in the dairy sector of late. Probably the highest profile transaction has been the acquisition of the Murray-Goulburn business by Saputo out of Canada. And, dare I say it, there was a fair bit of interest from China in that process as well. But, that Murray-Goulburn, yes, a big operator, but there's a significant amount of other interest in other dairy assets, both upstream in the production side of things, midstream in terms of processing, and downstream in terms of packaged dairy products. I think there's huge opportunity, because asset prices have been quite subdued for some time in the dairy sector, that's certainly an opportunity for investment.
Yeah, and look, the rising middle class in China really want to give particularly their children really quality products, and certainly there have been some scares with local products, so it puts countries like Australia and New Zealand and others in a good position. Yeah,
you're right. Our biosecurity track record is second to none. New Zealand obviously has a strong track record as well, and I think that inbound investment is going to continue primarily off the back of that biosecurity track record. Our proximity to Asia is another reason why we're seeing so much interest from Asian sources, and I think the rule of law here is quite strong. Our desire to deal more with Asian neighbours continues unabated. So I think you'll see that sort of continued interest. When I think about inbound Asian investment, they're really looking at a threefold benefit associated with that investment. If there's land assets available, what we've seen from independent surveys of rural land transactions over the last 20 years, it's experiencing growth rates up to 10% per annum in land value appreciation.
So it's not just what we're seeing in the cities, with Sydney, Hong Kong, Auckland, Tokyo, New York, top pricing for city apartments and land, but you're now saying we're starting to see that emerge in the country? Yeah,
the Rural Finance Report that's produced on an annual basis talks about a lot of those transactions that are occurring, a very comprehensive study of land sales that are occurring in rural regions around the country, and the growth rates have been quite strong for the last 20 years.
And that might be useful. I mean, I guess one of the issues with the sector is it's an ageing sector, the family farm moving through the generations, and of course with younger people coming through, studying some of the more modern techniques. So are you seeing that some of these landowners want to exit, or they're just looking to have partners to grow their business?
Some are looking to exit, no doubt about it. Their children aren't following them into the business. That's an opportunity for Australian agribusinesses to acquire the next door neighbour's property, or a business in the same supply chain. Equally, capturing that inbound investment, the international investment. They're not wanting to take over these businesses completely. They're wanting to keep management on the farm.
They need help, don't they? Right.
They do
so if they're expanding, that's actually creating jobs in local economies, which is great.
Yep, correct. If I think about the other two reasons why I mentioned that threefold view that they're taking. Land value appreciation, the operational profits is the second thing that these agribusinesses can generate, and some are generating very strong operational profits. And thirdly, they're getting access to the offtake.
Yeah, and look, the offtake is really what a lot of the Chinese investors want, isn't it? To be able to take that Aussie produce back to China.
We're never going to be able to satisfy that demand from the burgeoning middle class, Stacey. It's enormous.
Yeah.
And as I say to all of my clients, think of us as no longer the food bowl for Asia. Think of us as the gourmet deli for Asia.
Yeah, absolutely.
Continue to charge a premium for what you're producing.
Aussies being able to get access to produce, do you ever think that will happen? That all of the produce is sent overseas? I mean, that's some concern from some people.
I think there's a balance, right? There are existing customers that Australian agribusinesses are supplying to.
Yep.
What I'm trying to do is open people's eyes to the opportunities that present in different Asian markets, and it's not just about China either.
Yep.
There's 250 million people in Indonesia that love what Australia produces.
Yeah, absolutely.
as well,
and
right?
they're our closest Asian neighbours, right?
Correct. So when we're thinking about diversity, it's really not being beholden to the large retailers here in this country. It's also creating opportunity to diversify into Asian distribution channels as well. Giving them that diversity is quite important, and equally sourcing that capital from those investors who want the offtake can allow those businesses to grow, because it is, as you rightly pointed out, very patient, long-term capital.
Yeah, and in terms of companies that are thinking, well, I would like to expand, I do need capital, I've got great ideas, I've got the expertise, I've got a long history in doing it, I'd like to get, overseas capital, particularly, as you say, with the offtakes. What do companies need to, or businesses need to do in that sector to become, I guess, investment ready?
Yeah, that's a very, very important point. Because a lot of businesses think they're investment ready, but they're not. They've got to have the financial discipline in place. You've got to have the financial modelling, perhaps forecasts for where your business is heading in the future, a detailed information memorandum about what makes your business so attractive. Mm-hmm. You've really got to have a compelling proposition to take to these investors.
Many of them won't have experience in putting that together, but also in a way that the Chinese will resonate, that you're answering their questions.
Yes, that's right. I mean, most Asian investors will look at businesses that are brownfield or in existence.
Right.
Greenfield is a bit of a challenge for them to get their head around. So if there's a short lead time in terms of constructing an abattoir facility, for example, they'll consider that because they know there's a finite construction period, and then profitability ensues immediately thereafter. But by and large, the investment that we're talking about needs to have returns pretty quickly.
So having that track record that existing, that they know what they're getting, because often I've seen businesses trying to get capital to essentially buy the farm next door and expand and so on. So they're wanting to sell, creating a new farm or a new crop next door, where the Chinese investors say, no, I want your existing one. How do you balance those kind of competing interests and explain that, I guess both the farmer and the investor to be a little bit more flexible?
Yeah, you really need to focus people's attention around the key attributes associated with an Australian agribusiness. And I try to take away a lot of that noise when I'm talking to these Asian investors, not be too concerned about, where this is going to be heading in 5-10 years' time. Let's just think about the here and now why you are so attracted to this investment. And equally, when I talk to the Australian Agribusinesses, making sure they present themselves in such a favourable light that you're going to be inundated with interest from not only Chinese investors, but Indonesian, Singaporean, Malaysian, Japanese, Korean investors.
And who do you need on the deal team to bring all that together to make the farmer or the business investment ready?
Yeah, so my Darway business is David Thorn.
Yep, and you've got all that experience from banking and the amazing things you've seen over the years.
Yeah, thank you. Equally, I do have a great network of people within my virtual team.
Yep.
People that do the valuations, do the financial modelling, help with the FIRB process.
Right.
All of those people who are part of my network here domestically work with me to help present those Australian agribusinesses in the best light. And equally, my network in Asia, which has been built up over the last 20 years,
yep.
I still keep that alive by regular visits. Every couple of months I'm back in Asia and keeping those people in the loop on the emerging trends that are occurring in Australian agriculture.
And it's all about relationships with Asia. And here we've got a highly evolved professional services, but how do you know who is the right valuer or other services that can really tailor to that particular thing? And that's what you've been able to, curate through your experience.
That's correct. The Guangxi that has been developed over so many years. Hopefully I'm a trusted source of support for that inbound investment, and in fact I'm working with a couple of groups on the buy side in the beef sector at the moment, looking to find the right business for them to invest in the beef sector. So there'll always be interest from Asian sources, and I shouldn't really, I know this interview is focused on a lot of inbound investment, but there is a very strong emerging part of the investment sector or landscape that is coming from domestic sources.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the super funds are now getting, large super funds are now getting an understanding that this is a sector they can invest in, that there are some good returns to be made. It's just that, as you say, it's got to be patient capital, which is what superannuation really is about.
Yeah, correct. And thankfully that is going to increase. I heard from the one of the major super funds at the Global Food Forum here in Sydney last month about the fact that they need to allocate a certain percentage of their portfolio to the agribusiness sector. And if you think about the trillions of dollars that exist in superannuation, having that sort of scale of investment into Australian agriculture is really quite cathartic.
And good for Australia, absolutely. So David, what are your top 3 tips for our SME listeners?
Top 3 is very hard to distill down to, but I guess to my earlier point around a compelling offer, I think you've got to make sure that you have a product or service that can differentiate and indeed protect itself in the Asian market, and you can extract a premium price for that product or service. You've really got to ensure that your Asian partner is going to provide you with that patient capital that we talked about earlier and good distribution channels into those Asian markets. And last but not least, understand the route to market, understand the risks associated with that route to market and the regulation associated with those channels.
So lots to consider.
Having that right partner, you'll be able to navigate those distribution channels quite comfortably.
Excellent. So that's been really enlightening about the agriculture sector and the opportunities, not just in China, but in other countries in Asia and, of course, domestically. So I'm Stacey Martin, host of the Aus Asia Business program. You've been listening to David Thorn from Darway Pty Ltd. Shasha, David.
Thanks very much, Stacey.
And Zaijian to our listeners.
Thank you for listening to the Aus Asia Business program with our host, Stacey Martin, our Asian business specialist and expat financial advisor. Powered by Eagle Waves Radio and broadcasting proudly from Vivo Cafe, Sydney.